Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Manfree, Ovations Director of Community Programs and Partnerships, and I'm so pleased to welcome David Hein today. David is a Canadian librettist, composer, lyricist, musician, and actor who co-wrote Broadway's Come From Away with his writing partner and wife, Irene Sankoff. Together, they won the 2019 Olivier Award and were nominated for the 2018 Grammy Award and the 2017 Tony Award for their book and score for Come From Away, with the show itself winning the 2019 Olivier Award for Best Musical, 4 Helen Hayes Awards, 5 Outer Critics Circle Awards, and 3 Drama Desk Awards, including Best Musical. David and Irene were also the recipients of the 2017 Outer Critics Circle and Drama Desk Awards for Best Book. Their first show, My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding, based on David's mother's true story, was produced by Mervish Productions in Toronto and played and won Best Musical Awards across North America, with David and Irene performing in most productions. They are currently working on projects with Disney, Warner Brothers, and Netflix. Irene and David are the recipients of the Good Neighbor Award and the Four Freedoms Park Conservancy and the Meritorious Service Cross of Canada. David, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm so excited to talk to you about the show. I'm a huge fan.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
So can you tell us a little bit about how this started for you, where it started for you, what inspired this piece?
I mean, I think where it really started was Irene and I living here in New York. We're in New York right now. And we were living at a resident for international graduate students up at around 120th Street. And on 9/11, my cousin was in the towers, but fortunately got out. She was on the ground floor, and there had been an explosion 10 years earlier, and she knew to leave when it was time.
Yeah.
But we spent all day waiting for news, and we spent all day in a community of people from around the world, these international graduate students who took care of us, and some of them played music for us, and we all ate together, and we came together as a community watching the smoke downtown. I saw the theater community come together as we put on shows, and it became a lifeline for people to find community and to be with other people at that time. And so years later, when our friend Michael Rubinoff came to us and said, "Do you know the story of what happened to Gander?" We had heard it a little bit. We had heard people saying, "Thank you for taking planes," and we obviously weren't responsible, but all of Canada got credit. And so we started researching it, and we found out that the 10th anniversary was about to happen. There was going to be a commemoration ceremony in Gander, and all of these come from ways, these people who had been stranded there before were returning to commemorate what had happened, to reunite with these lifelong friends, and to acknowledge that their lives had changed on that day. And so we applied for a grant, and we went out there and we interviewed everyone we possibly could.
Amazing. So I know you've said before that between the 9,000 Newfoundlanders and the 7,000 Come From Aways, you joked that you had like 16,000 stories after that interview process was done. I'm so curious, what was the organizational process like when you began trying to sit down and say, okay, we're going to make this into something? Like, I just picture a wall of Post-it notes.
I wish organization was really part of it. It was a lot of notebooks, and I remember like tiny little mouse type. We had like just pages and pages of every story we wanted to fit in, every delightful Newfoundland saying or just fact about Newfoundland that we wanted to fit in, and we just pages and pages and pages and pages and pages on top of in the middle of it. We had never done this before. We'd never interviewed anyone. So we started interviewing the flight attendant on the plane out there, and then we interviewed the person who checked us into the hotel. We interviewed everyone, and about 5 people in, we suddenly were like, we can't write fast enough to get all of this down. And we had just gotten iPhones, and we were like, do these record sound somehow? How do these record sound? Right. So we learned about voice memos and record. And so we came home with, just hours and hours and hours, because we would spend all of this time with these people and not only hear a million stories. Every single person had a dozen stories of people living in their houses, or ways that they helped, or ways their neighbor helped. But then also, after spending 4 hours with someone, you've become friends with them. And Beulah would invite us to the Legion to get screeched in with Beverly and Claude and Nick and Diane, and then we would go to another event with them. And so by the end of the time, we had just hours and hours and hours of interview time with our friends, and we went home and listened to them for the next, 5 or 6 years as we wrote it.
Amazing. Um, so how many do you think you got in there of the 16,000 stories?
I mean, it's a joke, but honestly, it felt like 16,000 stories
Have all
sometimes because
16,000 in there.
I mean, the real challenge wasn't, well, it was obviously telling as many stories as we could because all of the stories were so good, and there
Yeah.
was there was never any impetus. There sometimes impetus from other people to say, why don't you just invent a bomb threat, or why don't you just invent something? And we were like,
Mhm.
these stories are so good. Why would we ever invent anything?
Yeah.
So a lot of it was about just how do we compress them in, but also there was we met a lot of people named Diane and people named Kevin,
Right.
and so along with just making the Newfoundland sayings intelligible to people, we also had to make the story intelligible. So we had to composite some characters and bring them together and combine these two stories to make it
Mhm.
into a through line. But throughout it, our overall goal was always to tell as many stories as possible, to give credit to as many people as possible, and to be true to the spirit of what happened, even if the slight details shifted from one place to the next.
Yeah. So I guess the question that I have then is how normally I feel like when you sat down to write a musical or a piece about a true event, there's like given main characters. You know where the focus is going to be. Um, and what I think is, I mean, obviously you have all these different people coming in and out of the story, but we do kind of have some characters that are the anchor point. How did you decide who to focus on? And obviously, I know many of those folks are probably composites, but did you create different archetypes?
No, I mean, we didn't have to create archetypes at all. I mean, a lot of it was when we came out there, there were very clear representatives who wanted to tell their stories and who stood out. And there was also stories that we found that were, we called them, you called them anchor stories, but they're spine stories for us.
Yeah.
They were people who had a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. The stories went through the entire event. They changed. They became someone else by the end.
Mhm.
Something shifted for them, and they had multiple points of contact for us to talk about. There was many other stories that were delightful and wonderful, but they were sort of a one-off anecdote about this person
Right.
tried this food and it was crazy, or you know, this person's husband found a new person in his bed sleeping there, and he was like, who was this? And the wife was like, I just invited them back, and it was delightful, but it wasn't a full story. So we
Yeah.
would so what we did was we sort of mapped out, this is giving it far more organization than it was at the time, but we mapped out all of these spine characters, and then we could talk about the anecdotes about food, or the anecdotes about music, or the anecdotes about faith, that we and try to combine those and drop them along the way. But it became very clear, partially because they were our friends, who we wanted to tell the story about.
Yeah. Um, at what point did you realize that Beverly Bass was part of this? I just feel like she's such a like you have a host of people that are all like regular folks, right? For in all of their different ways are just living their day-to-day lives. And then you have somebody who with like a real story behind them. I just and
Yeah.
who gets this like amazing, gets the 11 o'clock number essentially of the show. So what was that process like?
So Beverly was one of the people that we spent 4 hours with. I don't think she expected that. We had found her somehow and said, can we interview you? And all we knew was that she was a pilot at the time and that she had returned. She really wanted to come back. She wanted to bring her husband to Jungle Jim's, which was this restaurant next door. She wanted to introduce him to everyone. Um, we started talking to her, and the more we talked about her, I think during it, Irene and I kept looking at each other like, oh my God, we're going to write Beverly Bass the musical. This is an
Yeah.
amazing, this is an incredible life she's lived. But it also was, it was heartbreaking. I mean, she was coming back because her experience had been spending 5 days in a hotel room just by
Right.
the phone. She had not been screeched in. She had not gone out. She had gone to see her passengers and gone back and waited by the
Mhm.
phone. And she was someone who had devoted her entire life to aviation, and she was seeing the entire industry crumble. She had lost friends that day,
Yeah.
and so it was incredibly powerful. Um, Moment just spending 4 hours with her and then getting screeched in with her and her husband Tom later. We just became friends. We're still we're good friends with all of them, but Beverly has brought back countless uh, pilots and flight attendants and new women who are going into aviation who are inspired by her story and want to continue. And we constantly have these huge crowds of aviation amazing people in our audience. That's incredible.
That's amazing. And she has a children's book, right? Called Me in the Sky.
She does. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Amazing. That's
Yeah.
it's what a great legacy, right? To build not only the show and the life of this performance, but also to expand the lives of the folks that are in it. It's really, really special. Um,
Thanks.
so what I find so exciting about this play in particular, just as a piece of theater, is that this cast of like literal thousands is played by 12 actors. And it's hard, it's sometimes it's when you're watching it, it's hard to even realize that it's only a dozen people that are creating all of it, plus the musicians. So was that something that you two developed in the playwriting, or was that part of the evolution of the show as it got workshopped?
So in the original grant application, we said it's going to be a show that's going to be done theatrically. There's going to be just chairs, and everyone's going to play a part, different parts. People are going to play come from ways, and they're going to play locals. So I think a lot of that came from we are in Canada, and there's very little funding, and we have to make this as cheap as possible.
I mean,
Uh,
yeah, that's the
right.
theater.
But also I mean, there's something delightful, like the theatricality of the show. I think is part of its joy. What Chris Ashley and Kelly Devine, our director and choreographer, did on stage is this amazing magic trick of people changing a million characters just with a simple hat or a different
Yeah,
accent or a different body type. Um, but beyond that, I think what we did learn going through it was that in moments like this, you could always be a person who needs help or a person who is able to give help. And
yeah,
these are moments when it divides you into one of those two things. And so for each actor to have to play someone who is local and was able to help, and also someone from away who needed help, I think there's a balance of there of putting each other in each other's shoes.
yeah, amazing. Um, So I again, this piece I find to be very, very unique in the canon of musical theater. But were there any other pieces of art or other musicals that inspired the process for you both?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, we love musicals. Irene grew up watching 10 million musicals and seeing Les Mis a million times. And I grew up listening to acoustic folk music and Newfoundland music, and
Uh-huh.
so it is really a marriage of the two of our loves. And it was really joy when we started dating. You know, she would we'd go on these long car trips from Canada down to New York, and we would listen to musical after musical after musical, and then I'd play her Great Big Sea and Shanty Ganook from Newfoundland, and so we were sharing these things together. The musicals that I think most influenced us directly were we came down to New York once, and we saw once. We actually split
Oh,
up
yeah.
because we weren't sure that we could afford how many shows that we could see. So one of us went to see once, and one of us went to see Peter and the Starcatcher, and so. I came back from once being like, oh my God, that's the type of music that we're going to
Mhm.
do. They had fiddles, they had stomping, they had
Yeah.
acoustic guitars on stage. I was like, okay, so there's a way that we could bring this authentic, amazing, real music that's never been heard on a Broadway stage before. We could bring it to the stage. And I came running out of the theater excited to tell Irene that. And Irene saw Peter and the Starcatcher, which is all about group storytelling and theatricality and
Yeah.
using rope to create a cage and tipping people backwards and upside down and came out delighted to say we can do this, and we immediately went and just saw each other's shows, and so those two filled us up a lot.
Yeah. Having seen both of those and having seen Come From Away, I see that's a beautiful connection point. I love it.
I should also mention that we originally called it Laramie the musical because the Laramie Project was a huge influence.
Yeah.
It was docudrama. It was about for those who haven't seen it, it's a show about a group of theater creators who went to Laramie, and they're embodied in the show, interviewing people and taking on the roles. And so it felt like it had the same spirit with us going to Gander and meeting everyone and bringing them to life on stage again.
Yeah. That's I see that. So you mentioned earlier, you included a number of stories about faith. And I wanted to talk about a couple moments in particular, the inclusion of the character of the rabbi, and him starting the whole kitchen specifically for, kosher and halal and et cetera. I'd love to just hear a little bit about the inclusion of that character, and I know that there's that real person, Rabbi Sudak, there was a lot that kind of his story throughout the week was really fascinating. So I'd love it if
Yeah.
you could just tell us a bit about that.
So we didn't actually meet Rabbi Sudak on the 10th anniversary, but everyone told his story
Mm,
about him being there. And so when we eventually got to corroborate it with him, it was wonderful. But uh, he's not one of our main characters, but he is a powerful presence that comes throughout the piece. We first meet him when he is selflessly. I mean, this is a time when the Ganderites, the people from Newfoundland, are making all the food they possibly can think of to make. But having been out in Gander and uh, as a non-practicing Jew, but as someone Jewish, there is not a lot of Jews out in Newfoundland. There's not a lot of other religions aside, and we make a joke out of it a little bit
yeah.
it's a relatively Catholic Christian place, if anything. And I think what Rabbi Sudak articulated was that he was a passenger there who also didn't want to make any trouble. He didn't want to put an extra burden on them to make kosher food. And but some of the other passengers had noticed that he actually wasn't eating, and they
Mhm.
were worried about him. And so, what I love about that story is the selflessness was not just in Newfoundland; it was also in the passengers on board. And then eventually, when they came to him and said, "There may be other passengers like you who might need kosher food." He set up an entire kitchen, and they gave him a teacher's lounge, I think, where he could create a kosher kitchen, and he could feed a number of people, not just Jews there, but people from around the world who needed uh, different food. And
Mhm.
so that was an amazing story in itself. And then uh, later, he was told a story by a man named Eddie Brake who came to him and said that his parents had been in the Holocaust and he had been sent to live in Newfoundland as a small child, and he was told never to tell anyone um, that he was Jewish, and he wanted to tell someone. And uh, the rabbi and him developed a relationship, and I think for the rabbi, it gave a purpose to why he had been grounded there, and also a way to give back, to just to be there as a witness and to recognize that there are so many stories that get lost in tragedies like this that
Mhm.
it's important to tell them. So
Yeah,
he's an important character for us.
absolutely. And I know you've spoken a bit about the Jewish themes that are inherent in the message of the show about, when a stranger shows up at your door, you welcome them in. Can you talk a bit about that and just how it's resonated for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, our first show is called My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding,
Yeah.
which is about my mom discovering her sexuality and rediscovering her Jewish faith
Mm,
that she didn't really have growing up, and she's since learned Hebrew and attends a temple. My family doesn't, but I have learned so much through her,
mm,
and one of the things that I love is the concept of being open and discussing and listening, and the fact that religions can discuss together and work together, and find harmony together. Um, uh, and particularly, I like the idea of healing the world, which feels like when
yeah.
there are cracks in the world, when people are being hurt, that it is incumbent on us to help. And and I think the Newfoundlanders, although they are not uh, Jewish, they practice that, and the way they would articulate it is, it's just what people do.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so how do you feel now, how do you feel like the show is resonating, or does it resonate differently now in this kind of post-pandemic moment? I know it reopened on Broadway in 2021, played for another year, and has been on tour all over since then. So I'm just curious if you see maybe a different resonance in the piece now, having with all of the world having gone through this kind of collective moment of upheaval.
I think we've seen the show change for us in many ways. I mean, when we first started, we expected that it would be done that high school students would be forced to do it, that it would be a history piece and Canadian content for kids, and they could play trees and rocks and things like that. And so I think we've been surprised, although not surprised, because what's wonderful about doing a story like this is when you're moved and inspired by a story and then you share it with someone else and you see that they're moved and inspired by it as well, you feel connected to the world. And so having seen this now in Australia, it's going to Korea this month, in Japan, South Africa, I just saw it in South America, and to have all of these people around the world affirm that we all want to see people come together regardless of their religion or their race, to come together in times of darkness. There's something really affirming.
I think you're totally speaking to it. I mean, community is universal, no matter where you are. That feeling of, I mean, I grew up in a small town in New England, and I immediately recognized that small town, that just like how everybody talks to each other and the way that the folks in Gander interact. I think there's something that really rings true.
I think there has been time and again, when we were first developing the show, we were out in Seattle during the Paris attacks, and we had a conversation about whether we should comment on it, whether we should say something from the stage. And our director, Chris, said, I think the show speaks for itself. I think the show is about how you react in a time of tragedy. To quote Mr. Rogers, you look for the helpers, and there's far more helpers than there are people who are trying to hurt. And this story says that. And so regardless of whether it was that, or whether it's, the constant school shootings, or what's happening around the world right now during the pandemic, certainly, it was not a time for people to come together and get screeched in, but it was a time to look out for your neighbor and to be conscious of who needs help, and to recognize that different people have different needs. And so I think the show continues to say the same thing, but it speaks to different events.
Yeah, that's great. That's amazing. Well, David, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm so looking forward to seeing the show again here in Portland, and just again at this different phase years later, and just feeling how it resonates now. As a reminder to those of you watching, Come From Away will be here in Portland on January 12th and 13th, 2024. Tickets are still available, though they are going quickly. So I would recommend going to portlandovations.org and getting yours now. So you can join us for this incredibly special piece. We're so excited.
Thank you.
Thank you again, David. Thank you for your work, and thanks for talking with us today.
My pleasure. I'm thrilled that it's coming there. We have friends there, and we can't wait to see it.
Oh, good. Great. Thank you.